Welcome everyone to the Arupe Virtual Learning Academy's webinar. And we have the value of the expertise across our network. And this is a primary example of that because we have with us today, John Damaso, who did, and I know you know this because you're interested in joining, a really interesting experiment in ungrading. So John will be with us, but as always at AVLI, we like to start with a quick prayer, and I'm going to share my screen now to do that, and you can read along if you will. Heavenly God, spring is a metaphor for change. Some changes we eagerly await, and some we seek to forestall. Some changes we plan, and others arrive, surprising and challenging us. To all these changes, we ask the gift of your perspective, beckoning us to expectation, hope, and rebirth. May the sunlight and the rain be reminders that you are at work renewing the earth. As God of renewal, you are ever at work in our lives too. Open our eyes and lives to the needed changes in our lives this spring. Awaken us to new life and perspective, for we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. And I'm going to turn it over to John, and you see his brief biography there. And I'm going to mute my screen, and John, please show us what you did with ungrading.
Thank you, Carol. Special thanks to the AVLI for giving me this platform to just plant a seed about ungrading or returning to assessment in our schools. Like most things in my classroom, I've likely overplanned this, so I appreciate the prayer for change. So I may have to change some things as we go along, but I can see the timer at the top of my screen, and I will try to honor it so that we can get to your questions. So that's my daughter, Gia. She got a concussion yesterday, and weeks prior, this is her reaching up for the lock on the shed in the backyard. And it's a pretty nice metaphor for my approach to education. I'm in my 17th year teaching English. I've also taught Latin, creative writing, and film at Brophy Prep. And I'm always sort of reaching for that next shiny object of pedagogical intrigue, like it says there. And as I think about my young children, Marty and Gia, both pictured there, I think about my wish for their future when they go to school. And in a way, Gia is rubbing the genie bottle here, wishing for a future in which they go to school to learn and not to be rated, judged, and sorted, something that we as educators do every day and sometimes every few minutes in our classrooms. So I'm a writing teacher. I give a lot of feedback and I grade my students. And so as I thought about all the different pressures, especially this year with the pandemic, I thought I would try an experiment. And so I do want to offer a few caveats. I am currently back to conventional grading. I am by no means an expert in the field, just sort of a dilettante tinkerer when it comes to pedagogy. And I'm not trying to proselytize ungrading, only an examination of our grading practices in our classrooms and schools. So again, as a webinar, it's really a seed planter, hoping that we can have more conversations in our domains in our schools. So my goal today is to walk through kind of 4 little mini chapters here. One is the why and the what of ungrading. The second is the experiment that I conducted in an AP English classroom over the course of 5 weeks. Thirdly, I want to talk about the process that we underwent as a class. And then fourthly, the results. So what did students do? What did I do? And probably most poignantly, what were their reflections on this experiment? So let's start with the why and the what of ungrading. When it comes to the why, I think about the focus of my students as of late, and frankly, for 2 decades of teaching. Oftentimes they're thinking about how to improve their grade, not how to learn. The stress that comes with daily access to their online grade books, and anytime a grade is entered, if it goes down, they say that I destroyed their grade. And when you hear that kind of phraseology, it really takes me aback every time I hear it, because we come to a place to learn and they're filled with stress. And my friend, former English teacher, Austin Pigeon, down in the dean's office, he deals with intellectual dishonesty and integrity issues. And every conversation he has with students usually leads back to grades. I want to give my students more choice, and by going gradeless, I was able to do so. I want to engender their curiosity, and by going gradeless, I was able to do so a bit more. And I felt like my classroom was a little bit more joyful than it typically is. I'll add to this list another why, and that's the grade compression that some of our schools have seen. It's a little bit different from grade inflation. At Rofi, for example, in the English department, 95% of students got a B- or higher in the first semester. Some of that's COVID related, but a lot of it is just the rise of grade compression. So many great students trying to find a way to distinguish themselves and not being able to do so. So I'm not sure what these grades even mean sometimes. You've heard this before. Students turn to each other immediately after an assessment. What'd you get? And I often tell them, I really don't want to hear that. That's a private matter. You put someone in an awkward social position when you ask them that. And I'm hoping we can replace that with, what did you learn? I always ask my students when they come in from physics or calculus, what are you currently learning? So I'm not reinventing the wheel. People have been doing ungrading for a long time. I happened to discover this book in December. It came out in December. It's edited by an anthropological linguist at Notre Dame named Susan Bloom. And she's curated about 15 chapters from different kinds of educators, middle school, high school, college, some of whom have been doing ungrading, removing grades from kind of the daily life of their classrooms for years, or in some cases, decades. And then I started just poking around on Twitter to see who the mover and shakers were, the influencers in this area. And that's kind of what inspired my decision to just jump in January with an experiment. Along the way, chapter 1 of that book is by this guy, Jesse Stommel, and he did a webinar himself a couple months ago that I attended and got kind of more inspiration from. So in that webinar that he gave, he talked about 4-word pedagogy, and many of you are familiar with the 6-word memoir, where we kind of tell our stories in 6 words. And he encouraged educators to think about their pedagogy. And he shared, an educator from across the world, Maha Bali, who said, love first, design later when it comes to curriculum and instruction. So I love that the word love appears first. And then his own was start by trusting students. So when I say ungrading, you may be having a knee-jerk reaction. Well, what about students who won't do anything? So we have to start by trusting students. So I encourage you and myself, because I haven't done it yet, to develop a 4-word pedagogy for 2021 that may stick or that may evolve. One thing that he says in that collection on grading is our talk of grading shouldn't be reduced to our complaining about its continuing necessity. Like, I hate grading students, but we've got to do it. If we always stop there, we will never find that change that Carol shared in the prayer. I was chatting with a colleague here, Chad Unrein, about my idea. He said, well, remember in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? I said, oh, no, I don't remember that. But in it, there's a character, Phaedrus. He's a professor, and he is obsessed with quality, how to get quality out of his students. And he himself, in this novel 30 years ago, decides to stop grading his students. Quote, this time he developed the argument that the whole grading system and degree should be eliminated, and to make it something that truly involved the students in what they were hearing. He withheld all grades during the quarter. One thing I learned in ungrading is there's very different approaches, and I'll share with you my approach, but some teachers will do what are called contract grades. Some teachers will have the students name the grade and then rubber stamp it at the end. There are many different approaches. My operational premise after reading that book and thinking about 17 years of grading students was all my grades are subjective. All my grades are made up. And no matter my attempts at objectivity, rubrics, standards, checklists, student exemplars, at the end of the day, I'm rating and sorting and judging students by their work. And some of our grading practices, frankly, uplift our resource-rich, privileged students who have excellent Wi-Fi, who have parent support when they need it, who have additional time for homework because they may not have jobs. And we disadvantage, I do, other students, especially when our grading schema have some relationship to homework, for example. So when it comes to equity and inclusion, ungrading, I think, can help in those efforts. A few more quotes from Ungrading, this from the editor. From birth onward, humans in their healthiest states are active, inquisitive, curious, and playful creatures. Isn't that beautiful? Displaying a ubiquitous readiness to learn and explore, and they do not require extraneous incentives to do so. Do not require. according to anthropological research. Okay, well, what are some of these extraneous incentives, these external motivators? Grades, certainly. Getting into college, I need that A because. Threats from parents about, oh, you won't get to drive or you can't go out this weekend unless, some parents paying students for grades. Think about that. Teacher approval. This one's hard to shake, and I'll share in my experiment. Some of my students, without grades, needed a new extraneous incentive, me and my approval, even though I was encouraging them to develop the motivation from within. And then a big one that I was not expecting was peer pressure. They didn't want to be, quote, that guy who didn't participate in the 5-week experiment. So a few more kind of motivating thinkers. Alfie Kohn writes a lot about parenting and teaching. And he, in his chapter, in the preface to this book, writes, the more their attention, students, is directed to how well they're doing, checking their grades every few minutes at school, the less engaged they tend to be with what they're doing. And I got really kind of consumed with the what. Another writer about motivation, Daniel Pink, in Drive, he argued that extrinsic rewards and punishments stifle creativity, higher order thinking, and intrinsic motivation. That's from Daniel Pink, but quoted by a teacher, Arthur Chiaravalli. And then finally, from Susan Bloom here, she exposed me to this idea, the minimax principle, which I believe comes from game theory. The only thing you care about is something beyond the activity, like the grade, and extrinsic rewards, such as the grade. It is sensible to do as little as possible to procure the highest possible reward. So, and Dean Pigeon would concur, cheating, shortcuts, cramming, all those make total sense if the only goal is points or winning. All right, so what's the what? What did we do? I called it Gradeless January, but I took 5 weeks, my first unit that I had planned for this semester, and I entered 0 numerical or letter grades. And then I also decided to give students near total control of the curriculum. So no grades. I did consider contract grading, choose your own grade, conferences at the end where they assign a grade, but I ended up not grading them in any way for those 5 weeks. So I asked them that question, is this a good idea? I pitched it to them. And their response was strong, as you can see there, with 92.4% saying, yes, it's a good idea. All right, so what do we do in the ungrading experiment? I was searching for resources, and every time I typed the word ungrading, it would autocorrect to upgrading. And I kept thinking, okay, gosh, I really hope I'm upgrading my pedagogy, upgrading the student experience. And maybe you can help me determine if that's the case. But even in some of the emails back and forth with Carol, we were writing upgrading back and forth, even though we were trying to write ungrading. So I started by writing to my assistant principal, and I told them what I was thinking, and I told them my motivations, and I told them what I would be doing. And he gave me approval. He said, make sure you indicate that this is not a school-wide trend or that we are changing our grading schema at Brophy, that you're doing a pedagogical experiment. Then reached out to the parents, and I let them know what I was thinking. I told them about the book that inspired this idea. I told them what their sons would be doing. I encouraged them to listen to Susan Bloom talk in a podcast episode about her research. And I got a few responses. Most were very strong. Oh, I love this idea. Some said, will they never get a grade for the spring, which shows that they didn't read the whole email, which sometimes parents do. And in particular, I said, I'm copying the college counselors because I know this is junior year. It's an important year. They will continue to get prepared for the AP exam. And then at the very bottom, I said, it's important that parents reach out to their sons so that they can reflect on their learning at home, because metacognition and that awareness was an important part of my experiment as well. Learning how they learn was a big byproduct here. Now, this is a somewhat infamous study that's quoted in Ungrading. Ruth Butler in the late 80s, she had 3 groups of writing students. Some got a grade only, some got a grade plus a comment from the teacher, and a third group got a comment only. And according to summaries of the research, students who received only comments consistently outperformed the other 2 groups. If you Google this, there's a lot of pushback on these conclusions. There's more nuance to the study, but it's referenced in Ungrading, and I wanted to share it with you. So that might be a flawed experiment. Certainly my experiment was flawed for the following reason. Yes, I was doing ungrading, but I didn't roll with my original plan of giving them the content and then not grading them. Instead, I added an open curriculum. So it's not a perfect experiment. It had a lot of variables in it. So what were my students doing, and what was I doing during this? I started with a preliminary questionnaire, and you can see some of the questions and answers. I was asking them, general questions about the role of grades in their own personal educations. I was asking them questions like, would you learn more without grades? You can see the results down there. Over on the right, I was trying to get their appraisal of what the point of school even is. Is it about learning? Is it about getting the best grades possible? And this was so early that they didn't have a full understanding of the experiment. So I had to kind of probe a little bit more. One statement I asked them to appraise was this one: I need a grade to understand what or how much I've learned. And you can see a good number in the disagree, in the blue and the red at the bottom, nearly 50% said they didn't need a grade to determine what they were learning. In this question, it says, without grades, which of the following would be most important to my learning? Number one was expert feedback. So still getting assessed somehow by the teacher in the form of feedback. You'll notice the light blue peer feedback is the smallest wedge. The number one request was accountability. They wanted me to help them be accountable even though they weren't getting grades. So I would send sporadic messages of support and reminders. Peer feedback was last. And I think that's because we don't do peer feedback that well. So I'm still trying to get them to see the value of that. But a quarter of them said collaboration would be the most important to learning. 12% said choice, being able to select from a menu of options. And then some of them, 13, just said they wanted to design from scratch. So I used some of that data to inform how I designed the ungrading unit. And part of that was choice. So instead of reading a book that I assigned, I said, if you get to choose the book, what will you do? Will you go alone? And almost 58% said they would go it alone. A good number, 35%, said that they would try to read a book with a small group. In the end, these numbers flipped. More and more students flocked to reading communally with other students. And I think that's because, 5 books prior, we had made reading such a communal social experience that they wanted to be in literature circles and in smaller book clubs. And I'll show you kind of the books they chose and how safe they actually were in their selections. So you might be asking, and my students ask me point blank, what happens if so-and-so, Jose or Jimmy, what happens if a student doesn't do anything? And I would always take a deep breath and I would say, nothing happens to him except he'll learn a little less than you. And I kept saying it that way over and over and over. And it really kind of was a gross experience to watch them worry about the consequences for their peer if the peer decided not to learn. And it's because of that culture we've created through grading and sorting all these years at competitive high schools that made this question come out of them so freely, in my estimation. I asked them to make a proposal. So I did have a little bit of a framework to make them feel confident for the 5 weeks. They had to select an anchor text, a book length work they would read. They had to choose some paired text that they wanted to wrap around that anchor text. And this is a process they had seen me do the previous 4 units, where I picked an anchor text and then about a dozen paired texts, right? Poems and articles and short stories. Because we're preparing for an AP exam, I asked them to choose a skill development task for those 5 weeks as well. They could continue their vocabulary training on Membean. They could drill down in no red ink on a particular issue of grammar or mechanics, or even ACT, SAT prep. They could do Albert practice AP passages. They just had to pick a skill area that they wanted to work on that was unique to their own learning goals. And then they had to do a writing project. And I said, it just has to be writing of some kind. And they got to choose. So there are some of the anchor texts they chose. I literally said, this is a unit called My America. Choose any book that's 150 pages or longer that will help you get to your answer of what My America is. And so some of them, went on Goodreads and looked at reviews. Some of them asked their parents or looked at their home bookshelves or went to the library. But like I said, they played it pretty safe when given that choice because they've been so used to a teacher telling them what has literary merit. And they started circling around texts like, Huck Finn and Call of the Wild and Slaughterhouse-Five, Catcher in the Rye, safe bets that maybe their parents had also read. A few of them took some choices, read some contemporary literature, but mostly pretty safe. I did in their proposal ask them to say how they would annotate. They could do marginalia, they could do a video diary using Flipgrid, they could use a reading log that I designed for them, or they could choose none. Notice only 12.5% said that they will not annotate. Now, when the rubber hit the road, I'd say that number crept up to about 30%, chose at the end not to annotate their text, but this was in their proposal. So I had built a culture that was extended into the ungraded unit. And I really wonder if I had started in August with no culture of anchor text, paired text, annotation, I wonder what they would have chosen to do with an ungraded year. I gave them places, I gave them places to look for some paired text. So on Common Lit, there's a place you can look at different books. And if you click on a book, it will give you some suggestions. Some of them just Googled, or I conferenced with them on finding paired texts. And then I realized as we got into it, they felt pretty isolated. So over 5 weeks, we're talking about this big concept called My America. I started adding in what we called shared paired text. So one short paired text for the whole class to read and discuss per week. So it was a poem. It was that excerpt from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, a few kind of works to tie us back together as a class. So again, a flawed experiment, ungrading and this open curriculum. So how did students spend their class time? They'd come in, they'd sit down, I'd say, let's do the work. So they would sit silently and read. They might annotate. They might practice on Membean or No Red Ink. They might work on their writing project. They might come in conference with me, their teacher. They would do weekly surveys. That was a way of accountability. And they would also do update videos that were shared with their classmates, another layer of accountability to their peer group. We'd have small literature circle breakout discussions. Sometimes they would work in email threaded discussions to talk with students reading the same work that they did. And then, like I said, we had a few shared paired texts that we talked about as a class, and we did those typically in large parlay discussions, which I'll show you. So like I said, every week they did a survey, and then they did a final exit ticket. And this is a way for me to collect some of the data I'm going to share with you, and a way for me to check in with students who are not having a good experience. So in those self-evaluation checkpoints, they answer questions like these: which aspect of the unit is most important, the gradeless portion or the choose your own adventure portion? I asked them to complete the sentence: because Unit 4 is ungrading, I'm learning less or more or the same. You can see how evenly split that was into thirds. And then I asked them about their preference for reading. Do they like this solo reading? Do they like communal reading, small group reading? And again, different strokes for different folks. Our students did not agree on all of those different things. Over on the right side, you can see them answering questions about their annotation goal. Did you meet your annotation goal? Yes, no. Down below, how many paired texts did you personally read? Some of them read 3, some of them read 8. And there's a lot of variety there. As another layer of accountability, not just to me, because those surveys were just for me, I wanted them to be publicly a little bit more accountable to their peers. So I think just twice I had them do update of your learning videos via Flipgrid. And so you can see there's my assignment and announcement via Canvas. And I want to show you, I hope this works, one of the videos that a student made updating his peers on his ungraded learning so far. So
I'm doing Little Fires Everywhere as my anchor text, and I'm doing a lot of research, and I've been doing a lot of learning about the suburbs, the history of the suburbs, white flight. I've been doing a lot of kind of searching for personal narratives. I found this one Vietnamese woman who was talking about her experience as part of a biracial couple raising their child in the suburbs, and how microaggressions kind of destroyed that dream for her. I'm looking into the psychological and cultural barriers that come with transracial adoption. And so that's a lot of what I'm kind of diving into right now. In terms of like what I've learned about myself, I've just learned that like I do a lot better when I don't have a really, really strict lesson plan, or a lesson plan that doesn't involve stuff that I'm interested in, like membeing, etc. Because that stuff just never coped well with my brain. It didn't help me at all. So now that I'm kind of freed up, I have a lot of motivation to just research and dive into the stuff that I'm into. So yeah, that's what I've learned about myself and learned in general so far. Yeah. So I'm doing Little Fires.
So extremely wise, Jonathan shared his experience, what he was learning about his content that he selected, and what he was learning about himself. And that was his very first update video. Even though they're ungraded and working alone, they still want to get together and talk. So we would still have large group discussions. Writing questions for them to answer is really tough when they're reading 20 different books, but it was a fun adventure. And there's a picture of us kind of in hybrid learning, some students at home, some students in the classroom, masking. So I went for full-on change, like the prayer suggested, in January coming into this experiment. So we had our student-led discussions. There you can see a combination of Zoom on the left, and then Parlay is just a way to conduct student-led conversations, where students can look at prompts that I've proposed that you'll see in a second. I can pose polls to them. They can tap in to talk. There's some of the guiding questions that were for the unit that students could then discuss with each other in terms of their own reading and research that they were doing on their own. And then, of course, I could do kind of up to the moment polling on how they were feeling about the unit. And there you can see they're somewhat split there on how well the unit was going. Like I said, we use breakouts, whether it was in Zoom or in the classroom or here via email. I would find, who was reading what, put them into groups, and then, throw resources at them that they could discuss, whether they're reading Catcher in the Rye or Huck Finn or what have you. And then they were working on writing projects that I'll show you that were vastly different in nature. And I put a Dropbox up on Canvas, and I said, this week, if you want me to look at something and respond with feedback within hours, put it in the Dropbox. And then those things started to trickle in. And 64% of my students submitted something early to the Dropbox ahead of the end of the unit. So though there were no technical deadlines, I did say this unit has to end at some point. And if you want to really shape the writing project you're working on, send it to me. I'll give you feedback. I won't give you a grade. I'll say it's publishable, or it's revisable, or you should redo it, but there will be no grade. And 2/3 of the students took me up on it and got feedback on their memoir, their poem, their story, their essay, their unclassifiable projects that I'll share with you. And so my role in all of this was those daily check-ins with them, monitoring all those learning videos, looking at the survey data, and then giving them feedback. So this is a screenshot from my grade book. You'll see a grade on the far left, but that is because there are grades now entered throughout the semester. But you'll see a bunch of blank line items. So I wanted to make sure parents and counselors and the assistant principal could see what students were doing. So all those blue dialogue bubbles, those are individual pieces of feedback, commentary from their teacher on what they're learning. So they could see those. There was just no grade attached for those 5 weeks. All right, so what were the results? What did they do? Oh, that's a typo. Shouldn't say the what and the why. Let's look at the results. What did students do? They read about 20 different books across 4 sections of AP English. They worked independently on skills like vocabulary training, grammar, AP prep. And they chose and read paired texts that made sense for their anchor texts. They discussed this big concept called My America in small and large groups, and they worked on writing projects. Here's what they look like. Something very conventional, like a expository essay about race and Huck Finn, or things very difficult to classify that I could not even invent without the open curriculum. This student wanted to capture what 2021 America was through a Spotify playlist that he wanted to annotate in 2 different ways. So this is somehow an annotated playlist capturing 2021 My America. This student was really interested in political cartoons, so he picked 5, one from each of the last 5 decades, and did sort of a journal about the significance of those political cartoons and what they said about an evolving My America. I don't even know what to call this. We had read Great Gatsby. This student was a rower, and I think it's sort of a prose poem about the erg rowing machine and then relating that to the last line of Great Gatsby. Again, not something I could design. And then one student just said, I just want to do practice AP prompts. I said, God bless you. And he would pick out old AP prompts and practice them and send them to me and get feedback from me with no score, no grade. Again, I asked them lots of survey questions to find out how the experiment went. How satisfied were you overall? And I am not great at statistical analysis, so I present to you these bar charts. Maybe you could help me, but over 90% in the 7, 8, 9, 10 range on satisfaction. How well did the ungrading part of it go? Of course, our eyes love to go to the outliers. Don't worry, I followed up with the boy who said 1 and the 2 boys who said 3 to find out what stage of existential grief they were in, and we worked through it. If you were to grade yourself, what grade would you give yourself? It's college prep, like many of your schools, and you can see those pie wedges are big for A, A-, and B+. And I had to assure them this was not a trick. This was not a backhanded way for me to get a grade and enter it. I just wanted to know, based on their satisfaction, their, weekly reflections on their learning, what grade do you think they would earn? Now they're using our culture and our current grading system where a lot of students get A's and B's here. They're using that, I think, to inform their answer. I wanted some more kind of qualitative data. So I went back to the year 2008 when word clouds were cool. And I said, hey, in 5 words, tell me, how did the ungrading unit make you feel? Most students gave me 5 words. A couple students gave me about 150 each. But you can see the word cloud here of frequency. And they were positive and negative. So on the positive end, they said the ungrading portion of it made them feel free, relaxed, motivated, engaged, happy, relieved, responsible, and curious. And on the other side, they said that the ungrading unit made them feel stressed, confused, disappointed, disorganized. Some extreme words here like worthless, bored, and stagnant. So collecting all this data with Google Forms allowed me then to go and mediate with students who are really affected. I wanted to share now a bunch of observations from students, and this is in their own words, and they are eloquent and poignant and better at metacognition than I currently am for them at age 17. So this student wrote this at the beginning of the experiment. I think that this class format is really great. From my own personal experience, grades have always been a massive stressor, not a motivator, especially in combination with COVID, my anxiety and depression. I'm sure you're all nodding your heads. I'd honestly ask if we could continue this for the year, should the January trial go well. Another student said, I work better when I can do things at my own pace and have some level of personal interest, though I do think some level of pressure to get the work done should be applied. And I construe that as being accountability, but it doesn't need to be significant. Really interesting. Not everyone was positive though. This student wrote, I am drowning and need someone to help me remember how to swim and how to practice swimming faster. This student he's prone to melodrama, but I appreciated the use of the extended metaphor. Another student who had a rough time said, I learned that I don't know what I like. I'm so used to adapting to whatever the teacher tells me to do and eventually making it my own. That is my way of being exceptional. I take what's required of me and make it worth reading and worth writing. And I thought, what if we just empower this student by not forcing him to adapt to me? Another somewhat negative or ambivalent response: I feel guilty that I didn't do everything I was supposed to, but there's also no reason for me to finish it. So I guess I'm just confused. No reason to finish it because the external motivator of the grade wasn't there. So then I said, okay, all right, considering the ungraded aspect of this unit, what role do you think students ungrading should have if we're deciding the future of AP English language, or substitute your course title there? And you'll notice the students who said to avoid it, that's the light blue, a very small number said avoid it. Many of them said do it as one unit like we did. 32% said that. Some 32% said do it for a whole quarter. 15% said do it the whole semester. And about 12%, 13% said make the entire course ungraded. Some positives. I rated ungrading a 10 out of 10 because it provided a stress-free environment for me to explore topics of my interest on my own accord without the strain or worry of imperfection. This unit allowed for me to dig as deep as I wanted into my book without the fear and dread of due dates. I know this is long, but this is the student you saw in the video. Right, so grading as a system has never been healthy for me, he writes. Like growing up, I was raised on the idea that your grades equated your worth intelligence. And I found that the smartest, most thoughtful people I know often have not so great grades. Plus, my disabled, neurodivergent friends are super damn smart. So I started questioning the ableism of it all too. So I started interrogating why we grade things. And I found that it was rooted in avoiding punishment as an incentive, not in learning. Our grading system might seem rewarding, but if the reward is not getting held back and not I found what I love to do and got better at it, then what's the point really? Honestly, this student should be giving this webinar and probably teaching my course. A few long quotes. I know this is a lot. In terms of not receiving grades, I felt a sense of liberation. Switching quickly from working in a class and receiving a score to creating and following my unit, I experienced a different side of my learning that was new to me. I found that my expectations for what I wanted were always growing as I feed it more material to use in the unit. I felt less pressure to completely follow through with ideas that I enjoyed but later grew out of. I felt less of a focus on the external value of what I produced. I found I cared more for the reasons and journey of the production. I did not coach these students. They're just brilliant at reflecting on their experience. So some big numbers, and then we're getting close to the end and some questions. 97% of students self-reported that they read their entire anchor text that they had selected for themselves, even though they were not graded in any way on doing so. 85% of students completed a final writing project. You saw that 2/3 of them did an early draft. Some of them did just a final, but 85% total actually completed some kind of writing project. Half of students would assign themselves some kind of A grade during that unit that was ungraded. And then, as you just saw, 94% of students said ungrading should have some role in our class, whether it's a unit, a quarter, a semester, or the entire year. A few of my observations, they're not wise, they're just what I observed. More students chose to read in literature circles versus choosing their own book. So maybe it's safety, maybe it's the culture we've created of social reading, or maybe it's peer pressure, I'm not sure. The emotional responses that you saw to ungrading range from ecstatic liberation to existential crisis. But those in crisis, a small number, and it was great that I got to work with them one-on-one to unpack why they were feeling that way. And as you know, it probably had to do with things external from school. The written work that I read was more authentic and thorough for most of my students. Some of them, phoned it in and wrote really bad poems, and they knew where they were bad, and they thought, oh, poetry, it's short. But I had one student write a 9-page research paper, totally ungraded, redeveloped it 3 times, submitted it to the literary magazine. But the work just felt more authentic and thorough. That's anecdotal. And then some of my students have developed metacognitive awareness about the kind of learner they're becoming, and others had a hard time understanding the significance of the unit to their own learning. And then finally, I'm currently unsure of the role of ungrading in my teaching as I teach classes, as I lead a department here, and as I think about my children going to school as well. The student body was interested in what we were doing. The student newspaper wrote an article that you can see there about the experiment with ungrading and open curriculum. Next step that you might take at your school, and we can discuss it in the Q&A here shortly, is a book club. I'm not trying to invent anything. I'm just borrowing ideas and implementing them from Ungrading and Twitter. But I started a book club here. I have about 12 English teachers, about 4 administrators, and we've been working through the book kind of month by month, reading sections that you can see outlined and highlighted over there on the right. So I'm happy to help you if you want to set up a book club for this particular book. And I've been sharing with them a lot of the data from my experiment as well. So I'll end here at minute 39 with a question for you, and then I would love to discuss this and other questions. How do grades influence your school culture? I tell my students the hardest questions are the how questions because you can't answer them yes or no. They're even harder than why and what, in my opinion. So how do grades influence your school culture? And with that, I will end with my thank you screen and a call for questions.
If you have a question for John, feel free to either put it in the Q&A or in the chat section, and he'll be happy to answer it. And both of us can monitor it simultaneously. Or if you have an answer to his question, how do grades affect your school culture? Please put that in so that we can discuss that together. I do have a question just sort of initially, and that is, I'm curious as to the follow-up, since it's an AP class. Did you find out from students if they, in general, I have AP students now as well, and they're all starting to get pretty nervous about a test coming up in a couple of weeks. Have the students expressed to you at all whether they feel a bit more confident or not in terms of anticipating that, sitting for that AP exam?
Some of the complexity of the situation I didn't explain, which is it's an AP English language class, but it's also a dual enrollment class with the community college with a separate curriculum on American literature. So the way I explained it to myself and to my students is that in this ungraded unit, we are primarily focused on the big essential questions from that portion of the curriculum. So I have found that in the fall and all the work we're doing these last kind of 10, 11 weeks of the school year, that they are, that we've covered the content for AP. And now, like you, we're in that kind of review process to get them ready. So I guess in pragmatic terms, I just felt like we had 5 weeks that I could play with. And typically in those 5 weeks, we do a huge poetry chapbook project. So I already had 5 weeks that were a little bit outside the direct scope of AP. And I hope the College Board is not listening.
They aren't. That makes a lot of sense to me. We have a question from Frank. He says, did the ungrading period seem to produce more equitable outcomes in learning?
I don't know. My initial response is, well, it's twofold. One is I wish I had done the experiment a little differently where I didn't have the open curriculum, because then I could really measure outcomes against each other. Instead, because it was so free in what they were reading and writing, it's hard to do apples to apples comparisons. There's equity issues right now that are unrelated to ungrading, specifically the pandemic, and a lot of our students of color are at home. And as you know, probably from this call, being on Zoom is not the best way to learn. So there was just so many variables, and I hesitated a little bit to even do the webinar because of all the variables. But again, hoping to just plant a seed about assessment and grading generally. So that's a non-answer, but thank you for the question.
No, actually, no. It's an answer that makes a lot of sense. Their questions are starting to coming rather quickly. Here's a question from the AVLI president. The scaffolding you provided was really significant. It looked like most of it was done prior to the unit beginning, but some of the other pieces seem to be done on the fly. Did you find this to be the most difficult part?
No, on the fly is my bread and butter. I'm famous to myself for finding something at 7:57 a.m. and rolling it out at 8 a.m. I thank my administrators for giving me a lot of autonomy and freedom in the classroom. I always have my essential questions in my mind, but no, doing scaffolding up front, very important, but also responding to the needs of students, the changing landscape are really important too. But I love that sort of thing.
That's interesting. That's what I thought of when I was looking at the prayer, is that sometimes, that the trepidation or the freedom to kind of go ahead, and you wonder as a teacher if your skill set matches that. Here's a question from Ryan Williamson. Have you done units with that much student choice, but when you also had grades? That's a really good question, because student choice is something at AVLI in particular we're working on very, very actively.
I wouldn't say entire units, certainly projects that had sort of menu boards, one of those 9-box grids where students could pick and choose from there, a lot of choice. And then, a uniform rubric that somehow I could apply to all of those choices. So yes, and then grading them. But then sometimes students are looking around like, hey, that student's 2-minute video didn't take as much time as my 10-page screenplay. And then you get into all of that nickel and diming stuff, which is antithetical to teaching and learning, but not a whole unit.
So just to follow up with that, this level of student choice works either exclusively or definitely better if it's an ungrading situation.
I can't answer that. Yeah, I think student choice is important and it should be part of our toolbox.
I agree with that totally. Are there any more questions? I think we've gotten to all the ones that were in both the chat and the Q&A. And if you have other questions, feel free to type them in. Just an overall question, and also a thank you. So I want to say thank you to John. This webinar topic has generated more interest from people. I send lots of emails out and lots of announcements. I was overwhelmed with the response. Oh my gosh, I really want to do this. Or and here's someone else saying, wow, thanks for all of this. His question is a little bit the same as what I was going to ask, so let me read it. He's wondering if you have a sense, anecdotal is great if that's what you've got, about the type of student likely to enjoy or not enjoy the ungraded portion. Did you notice a divergence between students who didn't like one part and liked the other part a lot?
Yeah, it's going to be anecdotal for sure, Kevin. I thought they would neatly fit into categories of who enjoyed the ungraded portion and who didn't, but it didn't. So I'm thinking of a couple of students. Some of the type A driven, good at school kind of students actually, floundered quite a bit when it was ungraded because I took away their main motivator. And then some of the, I would say, lower achieving AP, they're still AP students did really well in this environment and loved it because I took away the stress. I focused them on learning, and they, may have had a B- in the first semester. So I also should have added the caveat that this is a group of AP students at a college prep high school. When I talk to my colleagues in the book club who don't teach AP, they wonder of the effectiveness of an experiment like this. And so I would encourage them to read the different chapters from Ungrading because, every single school environment is discussed in that book, 15, 16 different perspectives.
That you've just you had not only planted a seed in school communities, but you've planted a seed here at AVLI, because we had a summer book club, not last summer because of the pandemic, but the summer before we did a book club, a cross-network book club. So this might be something we need to think about as an organization. And let's see, we're committed to letting people go back to their classes, whether they're grading their students or not. And on behalf of everyone at the Arupe Virtual Learning Institute, all the teachers and all the school communities, John, thank you so much. We're so happy to have you on board. John is part of our network of expertise in teaching, and you will definitely be seeing more of John in the future. I will be sending a follow-up to everyone who joined us, and with a couple of questions of my own. If you could answer those at your leisure, I'd appreciate it. And in the meantime, have a safe and lovely rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you in whatever aspect as we go on with our programming at AVLI. Thank you so much. Bye. John, hang with me a second.
Thank you, everyone.